As I mentioned, the Maryland Native Plant Society, our mission to promote awareness, appreciation, and conservation of Maryland's native plants and their habitats. We are a 501c3 charitable organization. We are a volunteer-run organization, and so all the activities are made possible through membership and donations. So we hope that you will join or donate to the society to help support our programs. Most of them are free, so we do that because we feel it's part of our mission to educate people. We are going to have a couple more Zoom programs coming up in July and August. They will be up on the website shortly. Because of the interest in this program, we are making the Zoom programs for members only after this one. So please make sure you become a member. But non-members and anybody can see it on the live stream on YouTube. So we have in July, Emily Southgate will be talking about the post-glacial vegetation, and Karin Berghart is doing native planting and other landscaping techniques. So again, go to mdflora.org, you can find more. And I think one of the things I learned with Zoom is I have to pause before going to the next slide because I think it cuts me off if I go too fast. The annual conference, a lot of you have participated in our annual conference, which is an amazing weekend of speakers and field trips. We're doing it a little bit different here because we can't guarantee we'll be able to do field trips, so we're doing some webinars. We are looking at field trip options just in case we're able to do those safely. The registration is open on for this, so you can register, and we don't have all the details, but if you register, you will definitely be kept informed of what's happening for that day, whether it's the webinars or field trips or some combination of the two. Okay, so you are all here to hear me speak, and I'm Karen Molinas. I'm the Vice President of the Maryland Native Plant Society. In doing our very first Zoom presentation, I went back and forth to what I could do, and as I went through all my thoughts, I landed on native plants, and it's from pollinators' perspective of what native plants, what pollination is all about. For the photos, I hope all of them have the credits on them. If they don't, I do have all the credits for the photos. So the first thing is, let's start at the beginning about pollination. So we showed you a little bit earlier about the chat box. So now's your chance to test out the box. And so to start at the beginning, we have to actually look at the reason for a flower. So in the chat box, find the chat box and write what you think the reason for a flower is. And Anne's going to monitor that. And as she thinks enough people have sort of given a response, we'll reveal an answer. So I can see them popping up. Okay. So Anne, how many people do we have on our talk so far?
We have 53 participants so far.
Okay.
And
Great.
people are saying reproduction, pollination, coevolution to support animals.
Okay.
Attracting pollinators.
Mm-hmm. Not because they're pretty. Okay. Advertisement. I like that one, Kristen. Okay.
Karen?
The reason for a flower is to make seeds or to reproduce. So if you put that answer, that's or some similar relationship, the reason for a flower is so that the plant can make seeds and create the next generation. So pollination is fundamental to making seeds. So just so you know, my outline of my talk, I'm going to go a little bit about basic pollination. I'm going to do the costs and benefits of what it means to pollinate via wind or by insect. And I put insect in quotes, and you'll see why I do that. And we're going to look at it from both the plant perspective and the insect perspective. And then we'll end with a little bit of pollinator gardening. But I'm not going to go into detail on that because in August, there will be a talk that focuses much more on that. So Kirsten just said YouTube's not working. You might want to just go to the main YouTube channel because I think that's where the confusion is whether it's on the YouTube channel or the live stream. But regardless, this recording, because Anne is recording it, will be put up on YouTube after the fact. So if you can't figure it, if it doesn't work, it will be there afterwards. Okay, so pollination is basically plant reproduction. It's how when you have, let me see, I have to, there's things popping up on my screen, sorry. So with the nice generic flower that you have here with the sepals and petals, for pollination, you have the female pistil, and I always reference Chris Fleming, my mentor in plant and botany, plant ecology and botany, saying the pistil packing mama is right here, where you have the ovary, the style, and the stigma, and that's the female parts. And then in other plants, in most plants where the male parts are also contained in the same flower, they could also be separate flowers, are male and females. We're not going to get into that. That's a whole nother talk. But with the male, the stamen, and again, you remember that because it's got the word men in it. So stamen, watch out for that pistil packing mama, as Chris Fleming said. This has the long filament, the anther with the pollen on it. And then the goal of reproduction is to have the pollen eventually make it to the tip of the stigma so that the pollen tubes can form and grow down and reach the ovules, or the to fertilize these ovules, which will eventually become a seed and then ultimately be where the baby plant is. So reproduction, so pollination is all about sex. It's also got a little bit about gluttony, and we'll talk about that as well. So come on, screen. You can go one more. There. Okay, so for pollination, there are two basic types. There's abiotic pollination, so that's using wind or water or even gravity to pollinate a flower. And grasses are a classic example of wind-pollinated plants. I'm not going to talk about water pollination, but the function is all the same, but some of the mechanisms are a little different. But for wind pollination, a standard grass flower kind of looks like this, where the filaments are long and loose. The anther is just filled with pollen. Because the concept of wind pollination is as any movement of this filament happens, the pollen will easily get released and into the air. The stigma, the female parts, they tend to have very feathery stigmas so that they can kind of act like a filter to just capture anything that's in the air, especially any pollen that is in the air. So the idea with wind pollinated is that any breeze will just come and blow the pollen into the air, and it will be kept aloft long enough so that it can then land, we hope, on one of these stigmas to then do the fertilization. So it's one mechanism of pollination, but I think most of you are more interested in the biotic pollination, of where our nice mascot pollination is our bee, and you have these beautiful showy flowers where the bee can fly into the flower, go in there to collect pollen or nectar. And while it's in there, it can get covered with pollen, or maybe can even gather pollen. And then the idea is it takes that pollen and it physically carries it over to the next flower. Unlike wind pollinated, where the pollen just goes into the air and hopes it lands on a flower, this one is designed, biotic pollination is where it's actually an animal carrying the pollen from flower to flower. And you'll hear I use the word bees and insects because that tends to be the most dominant pollinator that's out there, at least, as I always say, at least here in Maryland. I don't know anything about other parts of the world, so I'll talk about Maryland. So pollen does come in all shapes and sizes. But one of the things about grass pollens, which is this one in the lower right, is grass pollens tend to be very smooth, without a lot of these dimples or protrusions. And that's so that as it goes through the air, there's less friction and it can move freely through the air in order to make it to another plant. While these more elaborate shapes are something where they can be more easily gathered by one of those insect predators. So that was the fundamentals of pollination. You just want to get pollen from the anthers to the stigmas. And however you can do that, that works great. But one of the things when we talk about pollination is this relationship with insects. And the two, a flower, pollination, and insects are so hard to separate because they are so intertwined with each other, where the flowers really have taken advantage of these insects to be able to move their pollen, while the insects have taken advantage of plants for food, the nectar and pollen that the plants provide. So they're so intertwined, it's really difficult to sort of talk about one without the other. And this is just a quote from E.O. Wilson, who's just got some interesting observations about life. So when we talk about the strategies about pollination, is in evolutionary biology, you talk about the costs or the risks of what will it cost the plant to make pollen. If they're making lots of pollen, such as this grass that is just, being broadcast throughout and all over the place, versus one of the flowers that's being carried by an insect. The question is, do you go by quality or quantity? So not that each of these little pollen grains isn't valuable, but when you think about, do you put out a whole lot of small, inexpensive to make pollen versus a few more expensive to make, but you have them more targeted? That's a cost that flowers have kind of balanced out in terms of pollination and reproduction. The flowers themselves, do you make a big showy flower for when you're pollinating by wind, or do you make your flowers showy so that you can attract that very specific insect pollinator that is going to take your very special quality pollen to take it to your next flower, similar flower? So the costs of making flowers is something that has to be balanced. And then, of course, if you're attracting insects to your flower, then you have the risk that they're going to be eating you. And insects will eat pollen. So do you make it so that there's enough pollen for them to eat, but you can still reproduce? Do you provide alternative sources of food, such as the nectar or plant material that they might eat instead of the pollen. So that's really an important aspect of strategies for plants. Of course, the benefits that you get is if you're able to spend a little bit money on your pollen and your flowers and accept some herbivory costs, then the pollination returns can be much greater because your pollen will end up going directly where you want it versus in these wind pollinated, if you've ever seen it in the spring where pollen covers everything. So if pollen lands on your car, it's kind of wasted energy by the plant. If it ends up up in your nasal cavities and causes allergies, it's a lot of waste. If a grass pollen ends up on a rose bush, it's wasted. So by having a very focused pollination relationship with an insect, you have more likely success in pollination. And then the cross-fertilization, because the insects can fly into different distances, and they're not as reliant on the weather, that you can actually have better cross-fertilization. And so I mentioned, what do the insects get out of it? Well, they get the food. The insects really are going into these flowers because they want the nectar for the sugar, and they want the pollen for the proteins. So that's what the insects are getting out of it. There are some insects that will eat the flower buds or other parts of the plants, or they'll be in the flowers to eat other things that come in to eat. So you might have something like a spider or an assassin bug that is staking out a flower waiting for a pollinator. But they may or may not have a lot to do with pollination, but they're there. So as I mentioned, I use the word bees a lot, as well as insects. And part of it with bees, which are actually, when you look at the whole order of Hymenopteras, which are the bees, ants, and wasps, they really are, the diversity of bees and other Hymenopteras, and the diversity of these flowering plants that we all kind of admire and appreciate and want throughout our lives, really appear to be because they have co-evolved, that as the rise in plant diversity and this pollination diversity and flower diversity is also when this bee diversity was happening. Or you could say it the other way around. This bee diversity was happening and the plant diversity followed. But the two of them are just so intertwined that it's hard to separate the pollination value of bees, wasps, and ants from the evolution and diversity of plants. So it's just such a fascinating relationship between the two. And one reason why we think of bees is because it seems like this bees was really where this explosion of plant diversity really happened. So let's see. Here it is. So for bees, there are some amazing resources out there for bees, including this bee field guide, which hopefully we'll have this up on mdflora.org. I can't remember if I put that up there yet or not, but it's a wonderful field guide to the bees of Maryland. And if you are not aware, we have at least 400 species in Maryland of bees. Now, we're not talking about wasps or ants, we're talking about bees. And in North America itself, we have 4,000 species. So you can just see this huge diversity of this very specific kind of insect, that many of them, and I don't know what the percentage is, I don't have it off the top of my head, are really dependent on flowers and their pollen in order to complete their own life cycle. So this relationship is extremely strong. And so I know several years ago, Plant Society did have Sam Droege speak about the bees. It might be worth having him back in a future meeting. Okay, so we're going to do another test. So This is one of my, oh, Anne just posted the link. This artist, Rosemary, she's got this great Bird of Moon comic, and let's see. I can't figure out how to launch my poll from here. Let me see. I might have to disable to launch my poll, but I'll let you look this picture for right now. Let's see, I'm going to pause this for a second. Okay, well, I guess I have to do here. I have to do it this way. So the question was, which of these was a bee? Do you need to see my picture again? Do I need to share screen again? So which of those is a bee? Can you guys see both the poll and the screen, hopefully? Anne, can you see both my screen and the poll?
Yes.
Okay, good. So Anne's going to monitor the poll, I think. Okay, so which of these is a bee? Image 1, you can only choose one. I think I set it up that way. Okay, a couple people have voted. Let's see, how many people? We have what, about 50 people on our talk, 55 people? Come on. We have one person on the phone, so I'll excuse her for not being able to respond. Okay. Somebody raised their hand. So the person who just raised their hand, let me see if I can unmute you. I can't seem to be able to unmute you right now. Maybe we'll figure that out. Okay, so I am going to end polling. Come on, you guys are not very cooperative. My poll, only 16 people have voted. So I'm going to end the polling and share the poll, share the results. And so we had one person thought image 2, which is a very sweet little insect. A couple people thought number 3. A couple people thought all of them were bees. And then another percentage thought that none of them were. And I will give you that none of these are bees. I would have given you if you said 1 was a bee, because you might have been confused with bees and hymenopteras, but 1 is a wasp. 2, 3, 4, and 5 are all flies, and 6 is a moth. So, but they all look like bees, and I think this is a whole nother subject to talk about, but would be the mimicry of the bees and this yellow and black warning symbols and how that relates to bees. And I think it just illustrates the role that bees have ecologically, and that they're such critical animals in our ecosystem, that there's so many mimics. And some of these mimics, like 3, 4, and 5, are actually pollinators, and they would be eating pollen and helping to pollinate the flowers. The hummingbird moth, or whichever species it is a pollinator. Oh, the whole page covered. You could have been. You should have been able to move it, Marnie. I see your quote. So this is just sort of thing that, even though we talked about bees, there's a lot of bee mimics, and a lot of insects are out there, same job as bees. And let's go to my next slide. And of course, we do have our other pollinators. We looked at the flies on that page. We do have the butterflies and moths, but bats, and not necessarily here in Maryland, but in other parts of the world, bats are really important pollinators. And here we have our down bottom right, is our ruby-throated hummingbird, which is an important pollinator of some of our plants as well. So we say bees, we might say insects, but there's a whole host of animals. And so the plants are working really hard to get these pollinators to come to them, get the pollen without eating too much. Oh, beetles. I see Carol mentioned beetles. Yeah, I didn't have a good picture of a beetle. Oh, way early in my talk, there was a beetle picture. And so there are a bunch of different strategies, and some of them are kind of obvious when we think about visual clues or even scents. And we'll talk a little bit about some of these strategies plants have used to get the pollinators to pollinate. And so our visual clues are the obvious ones, I think, because humans are pretty visual animals, that the color, whether it's bright white that sort of stands out or blues, that they're showy so that you can sort of see them from a distance. You don't have to be hunting for that mysterious little grass flower to pollinate it. You can have this really beautiful showy flower. And then a lot of flowers will have these nectar guides, these stripes on their throats, which some of them we can see, like these purple stripes, but under ultraviolet light, insects and other animals can actually see other kind of nectar guides to get you to go right into the base to get to the nectar, so that the plant can then have the anthers and the pistil and the situated in the right spot for the pollinator to get covered with pollen or to transfer pollen to the stigma. Some of the other color clues are, kind of folk wisdom. I haven't seen this sort of shown is that when you have these maroon flowers, like here on this wild ginger, that they often are mimicking flesh. And the smell of these flowers often is pretty bad, so they're mimicking rotting flesh. So the idea is with this, the color and the scent, they're attracting carrion-feeding insects that will crawl in here expecting to find dead meat. Yet instead they find nectar or pollen or something else, and they kind of bumble around, they get covered in pollen, and then they leave frustrated. And fortunately they have a sort of a short memory. So then next thing they know, they see the other maroon flower smelling like dead meat, and they go into it and they can pollinate. So that's a way of using kind of showy flowers and having scent involved. Because this is a presentation, I'm not doing a lot about scents, but that would be kind of a fun field trip to do the scents of pollination. Shape is also a pretty important feature of attracting pollinators, because you want your pollinators to be able to get to the nectar, and also to make it past all your pistils and your stamens. So for a lot of flowers, they might have a large landing pad. The design of the flower might look appealing and have a shape that's similar to the female of an insect. I didn't have any photos of that, but that's really a common strategy of some orchids and some other plants, where they kind of mimic the female of a species, and they even send out fake pheromones of that species to attract the males. And then it gets fooled, but ends up getting covered with pollen, and then ends up going and spreading the pollen. So when you look at the shape of flowers, it can give you a little bit of a hint of how it's trying to attract their pollinators. So with a sort of a general old flower, a lot of them are just designed so bees can easily zoom in there, land, crawl in to get to the nectar. I don't think I mentioned that, but the nectar almost always is way down at the base of the flower. So the bees can get in there and they can crawl. The pollen is readily lands on the bees, and the stigma is in a location where the bee will rub past it and pollinate. But as the shape of this flower becomes more tubular, it can attract different kind of pollinators, whether it's a long tube for hummingbirds or butterflies and hawk moths, and even these long-tongued flies where their proboscis is long enough to make all the way down those long tubes. And bats, they need a flower that's going to be big enough for to tolerate their weight and also provide enough food that it's worth the effort of the pollinator, the animal, to get there and get enough food to make it a valuable trip. Beetles like to crawl around, so it's got to be something where they can land and just crawl. And then you have the self-pollinated, which we're not going to talk about in this talk. And so this plant, the Star of Bethlehem orchid, is one of the famous ones in pollination. So in 1862, Charles Darwin was in London inspecting a specimen that was delivered to him. And it's this orchid, and you can't tell the scale, but this tube right here is close to a foot long, and the nectar is way down in the tippies of these long spurs. And so, as Charles Darwin notes, what insect can suck this? You know, it's a good 12 inches down there. Well, here's the picture of the orchid. I think it's from Madagascar, if I remember my notes correctly. So 20 years later, lo and behold, this moth is discovered that actually is the pollinator of this orchid. That tongue is long enough that when it comes and flies, it can actually reach that nectar. But while it's doing that, it's collecting pollen, and it's helping to pollinate this orchid. So this relationship between plants and insects is just phenomenal. And so then when you take your shape and your color together, that's where you get that classic red tubular flowers for the hummingbirds. And you can see on this one, this is the stamens and the pistils of the plant. And this hummingbird head is right there. So as it goes and flies, it's going to knock into the anthers, get pollen on its head. If it's already got pollen on its head, it's going to wipe the pollen off onto the pistil and fertilize this plant. So it's just so amazingly adapted. Oh, somebody just noted that there's another one that has a 16-inch nectary. So in one of my ugliest slides in my presentations, one day I have to make this one nicer, is just when you start looking at the shape of your flower here on the left and the color of your flower on the right, you can start making predictions of what kind of pollinators you would want. So beetles like dish-shaped, and they not too much into the real colorful ones. They're into the brown, the drab, the white one. So you can see how the beetle, you can follow that line down to white flowers or drab flowers to brown. So I always wonder, what is a drab? What color is drab? I'll have to look that one up. Versus the beetles, will generally go with these dish-shaped flowers. So it's kind of amazing when you can kind of do this matrix of color and shape to just see the diversity of animals that are attracted to that pollinator. And the last type, I think this is my last strategy for plants, is entrapment, which is probably one of my favorite, where orchids are classic on this, where the bee sees this big, beautiful flower, and it probably even has a fragrance. I don't know about that, but the bee just gets so tempted, and it wants to get the nectar and the pollen from this plant. And so there's just a very tiny little hole that it can squeeze in, and ends up falling into this the moccasin of our moccasin flower, or pink lady slipper. And it's kind of surprised because that's not what it was expecting, and so it kind of bumbles around, and then there are hairs on the inside that guide the bee back up through the slot, where it has to go past the stamens and the pistil, and so to do the pollination. And so it finally, okay, so Carol says no fragrance. Oh, and she also says the queen bumblebees get angry and eat their way out of the pouch. Yeah, bumblebees are known to do a lot of chewing of plants that way. But so it squeezes out. It's kind of relieved, but lo and behold, it sees another one and it does the same thing, because insects apparently do not have a long memory. And so that's one of the strategies that a lot of these entrapment ones use in order to pollinate. So just kind of fascinating to think that these two animals have kind of co-evolved for pollination. Milkweed is another one that's so fascinating, and I'm always embarrassed to say, it was probably 30 years ago, I did a little research project on milkweeds and their pollination, and I tell you, it took a lot doing this talk for me to like drag that information out of my head. But milkweed is just so fascinating. When you look at their flowers, they're just the most unique flowers out there. I think that they're unique in a way that's even more elaborate than orchids, but you have to get up and look at them. But for milkweed pollination, what they have is they have these things called pollinaria, which are these structures that have these pollen sacs that are covered with, filled with pollen. So when a pollinator, an insect, lands on the flower, this pollinaria gets stuck on the insect. And so it sort of flies back to another flower. When it lands on this flower, one of these sacs gets attached to the flower, and another of these pollinaria gets hooked onto where that pollen sac was, and it kind of keeps kind of going on. It's just like so crazy of how the milkweed has like taken advantage of these insects to make this just really elaborate pollen transfer. And this photo is of an insect that has these milkweed pollinaria stuck on it. And the research on this one, I didn't read the whole paper on this one, I just found it recently, was talking about male competition, that if you think of these pollinarias as the male flowers trying to compete for pollination, there was a whole strategy of, which one should be, if you're the first one, do you have a better success of pollination than if you're the second one? So that's, I think, what that paper was talking about. It was kind of fascinating, but just like insane strategy here. So, so to finish off, I'm just going to give you a year of flowers. As I mentioned, we will be doing a talk on flowers and pollinators in the landscape and gardens. So I didn't want to really go too much in that, but just the fact that throughout the year is an opportunity for you to be out exploring, admiring, appreciating what the plants are doing, and their own little secret strategies for trying to convince insects to get into there and pollinate them so they can actually reproduce. So skunk cabbage, I always say this is my last flower of the year. So you go out Christmas Eve looking for a flower, you can find your skunk cabbage, or you can go out New Year's Day and you find it, and it's your first flower of the year. So these whether you're aware of it or not, it seems like a lot of people are, but that the flower, as it's growing before the leaves come out, it produces heat, so it can melt frozen ground. It creates a warm spot. It's got a stinky, skunky odor, and it's got this maroon color. So what it attracts are flies and beetles, especially like this lesser dung fly was found inside the skunk cabbage to pollinate it and to create the next generation of skunk cabbage. So using that smell, the shape, this heat, as well as the colors to attract. It also shows that these pollinators are out year-round, so having year-round flowers is really an important aspect of if you're doing gardening, ecological understanding. So in early spring, here in Maryland, our trees are generally deciduous. So in this early spring, when you look up, you see sun, which then translates, it means that the sun is shining on the forest floor. and we end up in early spring with a huge number of spring wildflowers, which are really important sources of protein for overwintering insects, because if you're an insect who has overwintered, as an adult, I should say most insects overwinter regardless of what you think, it's what stage you're in. But the adults that overwinter, when the soil warms up, they become active and they have to come out and they need food to eat. So these spring flowers are really important food sources for overwintering adult insects so that they can get that protein and sugar rush that the flowers will provide to continue their next cycle of laying eggs and surviving through through the next generation. Things like the violets, there's actually a mining bee that is a specialist on violet pollen. So those little violets in your yard are really critical. And of course, columbine coming out in the spring, so that when the ruby-throated hummingbirds are migrating from the south and they're coming here to nest, that they have this the source of nectar that's really critical for making it through the that beginning stage of their breeding season. As the seasons warm, insects become more active, flowers are more likely to be blooming. So there's this is when we think of flowers in gardens, is the late spring, early summer. It's just, you could just probably spend an hour just talking about all those plants. And Jan Smith asked if bees would use non-native violets. More than likely they would. It really depends if there's pollen and nectar. And most of the violets that you find in your yards or out in the wild, almost all of them are native. So they might be weedy in your yard, but they're still probably native. And then high summer is when you just have this really flourish of flowers for all kinds of pollinators. So whether it's the whole, oh, Marnie says her button bushes just started blooming. Yeah, my button bush. In fact, that picture was the button bush I had in my North Beach yard, which was my favorite pollinator plant. And so in the summer, you have so many of these composites. These the aster family really starts coming into its full. I can't think of what word I want to use, but just so many, such a diversity. So again, this peak of flower activity and the plant growth because of sunlight and warmth coincides with this peak of insect activity because they are cold-blooded, that they need warmth in order to be active. So it's just coincides perfectly. But then even in the fall, when we have some of our few fall bloomings, like this witch hazel, I'm sorry, I didn't put the note that this was witch hazel, our native witch hazel, which blooms in the fall, and it actually has several different pollinators, including this fly that will actually be out there. And of course, as the temperature drops and gets cooler, the insect pollinators are starting to be less active. They're probably going, if their life cycle in the winter is to be an adult, they're probably finding places to hide and shelter. They might be laying eggs, and the eggs will overwinter, or be something like some of the caterpillars. So all of life in Maryland is starting to get ready for winter. And so that, like I said, just a quick kind of overview just to kind of get you teased for our talk later this summer. But when you think about your yard and your garden, it really can be pollinator friendly. That by putting out these native plants, it doesn't matter what native plants you're putting out there, there is going to be a pollinator and some ecological function involved. So whether it's this was my North Beach house, so whether it's just your tiny little sidewalk garden with, the coreopsis, or, you know, the milkweeds grown here, or this is the edge of my button bush right there. So it's all kinds of great things that you can do. So a simple checklist is like any kind of habitat. You want food, water, shelter. For the food, remember using native plants. The colors, if you saw, the colors make a difference and the shape make a difference, what seasons they're blooming, to give something all year round. And also, you know, you just really need to reduce or eliminate chemical use because the insects and the plants are really impacted from that. So allow them to sort of battle it out on their own if you want. So that is the end of my talk. So not sure what kind of questions have come up or if people have ones now. Let me see, before I close my screen, let me see, what are my next slides? Oh, this was just a reminder about our upcoming Zoom programs. So again, go to mdflora.org. And then this video will be on our YouTube channel as well as on MD Flora. And I think what I'll do